It was a summer evening in Cedar Falls, Iowa, June 12, 2009. The youth soccer team had just wrapped up practice at the field behind the elementary school. Parents gathered their kids, rushing to their cars as the sky turned dark. A storm was rolling in. Rain started to fall. Within minutes, the field emptied. 7-year-old Ethan Miller stayed behind. He was helping pick up cones and went looking for a ball that had rolled toward the fence. It was the last time anyone saw him. By the time his mother Rachel returned to the field, the storm had broken wide open. Sheets of rain washed across the grass. The floodlights flickered. Ethan was gone. The police arrived quickly. They locked down the field and the nearby parking lot. Volunteers searched the woods, the river, the ditches. Flashlights cut through the rain. Dogs sniffed the mud. But the storm had wiped away every clue. The ground was slick, the air heavy. No footprints, no tire marks, nothing left to follow. Then came the first tips. Some said they saw a man in a dark raincoat near the north exit. Others swore a blue van was parked by the curb, headlights on, engine running. None of it was clear. The storm had blurred every detail. 2 suspects quickly rose to the surface. A volunteer coach with a history of accusations that never stuck. A drifter in the neighborhood who often hung around the fields. Both questioned. Both denied involvement. Neither could be tied to Ethan. The evidence just wasn't there. The weeks dragged into months. Rachel begged for answers on local TV, holding her son's photo and shaking hands. The town turned on itself. Was it the coach? Was it the drifter? Or was it someone else who had slipped away in the storm? For years, the case sat cold, files gathering dust, rumors replacing facts. Until almost a decade later, when a prison inmate made a chilling confession. A name no one expected surfaced. And with it, the truth of what really happened to Ethan Miller. Ethan Miller was born in 2002. Rachel Miller was 32 years old in 2009. She was a single mother. By day, and often by night, she worked as a nurse at the local hospital in Cedar Falls. Her shifts were long, and the pay wasn't much, but she managed to keep a roof over their heads and make sure her son never went without what mattered most. She bought him soccer cleats, saved for his team fees, and made sure he had that jersey with the number 1 on the back. Ethan's father had left when the boy was only 2. From that moment on, Rachel carried the entire burden of raising him alone. She didn't talk much about the man who walked away. Instead, she poured all her time and energy into her son. At work, her colleagues would see her flip open a small photo album during breaks. She showed Ethan's school portraits, his first team photo, the little certificate he won for perfect attendance. She told them, "Every night shift, every double shift. It's all worth it if he has a normal childhood." The town itself seemed safe enough for that dream to feel possible. Cedar Falls, Iowa, a small community of just over 40,000. Neighbors knew each other's routines. Parents let their children walk to the park or ride bikes through quiet streets. The elementary school's soccer field was one of the town's favorite gathering spots. Almost every evening, families lined the sidelines while their kids practiced or played. There were folding chairs, thermoses of coffee, and conversations that lasted long after the final whistle. In Cedar Falls, people believed serious crime was something that happened far away in bigger cities. Not here. Not in a town where the loudest weekend drama was usually a high school football game or a dispute at the farmer's market. That belief, so deeply held, made what happened in June 2009 impossible for most to imagine. It was a Thursday evening, and summer had already settled over Iowa. The youth soccer team had just finished a practice session. The drills were routine, the parents chatting on the sidelines. The sky began to darken. Clouds rolled in from the west, heavy and fast. Within minutes, a summer storm was moving in. The coaches blew their whistles, signaling the end of practice. Parents hustled their children off the field, tossing bags into cars. Police arrived quickly. They combed the area, set up checkpoints on nearby roads, and called in volunteers. Flashlights scanned the trees by the riverbank. Dogs tried to track a scent, but the rain had already washed everything away. There were no clear footprints, no tire marks, no trace of the boy. Witnesses gave what they could. One said they noticed a figure in a dark raincoat near the north exit of the field. Another mentioned a blue van parked by the curb, its engine running. But the details were vague, blurred by the storm and the rush to get children into cars. Nothing solid emerged. Detectives soon focused on two names. The first was Gary Collins, 42 years old, a volunteer coach who had helped with the youth team. He had a troubling history, accusations of inappropriate behavior years earlier that had never led to charges. He had also left the field earlier than usual that night. His van looked similar to the one mentioned by witnesses, though the color did not match. Police searched his home, his car, his property. They found nothing. DNA samples came back negative. Gary denied any involvement, but suspicion in the town never fully faded. The second name was Derek Hall. He was 28, unemployed, living with his mother in a small house just a few blocks from the school. Neighbors said he often loitered near the soccer fields, sometimes with his phone out, snapping pictures. The night Ethan vanished, someone thought they saw Derek near the field, his figure partly hidden by rain. Police brought him in, questioned him for hours, searched his electronics. Again, nothing. No photos of Ethan, no evidence linking him to the crime. With no charges filed, both men were released. But in the court of public opinion, they remained guilty in the eyes of many. Parents whispered. Neighbors speculated. The town divided between those convinced Gary was the man responsible and those who believed Derek had slipped through the cracks. Neither theory had the evidence to stand. Meanwhile, Rachel's life collapsed under the weight of unanswered questions. She stopped working. Friends drifted away. People who once brought casseroles and sympathy now crossed the street to avoid her. She was seen sitting under the old soccer goal at night, calling her son's name into the darkness. Over time, she became known less as a victim's mother and more as the woman who had lost her mind to grief. The investigation froze. Files stacked in boxes, leads went cold. The case of Ethan Miller became another mystery stamped with the same words: unresolved. For years, Cedar Falls lived with the wound of that night, unable to heal because no one knew the truth. What no one realized was that the truth was out there, waiting in the mouth of a man already in prison. A decade after the storm, a confession would finally shatter the silence. But by then, justice would come too late to save a mother who had already lost everything. The evening of June 12, 2009, began like countless others in Cedar Falls. The youth soccer team had wrapped up a routine practice at the elementary school field. At 6:40 p.m., whistles blew, kids laughed, and parents called their children over. The sky above was turning gray. Coaches gathered cones and bags. Parents loaded cars. The ordinary rhythms of small-town life. The rain poured harder, washing across the grass and parking lot. Floodlights buzzed and flickered. In less than 10 minutes, the soccer field, a place of community and routine, was silent. One of Ethan's teammates, a young girl, later told investigators she had looked back through the sheets of rain. She saw Ethan crouched by the fence, reaching for the ball. At the same time, she noticed a figure walking past the side gate. A man in a dark raincoat. She couldn't see his face, the rain blurred everything. Her parents were calling her to the car, and she never looked again. At 7:05 p.m., Rachel pulled back into the lot. She stepped out of her car into pounding rain. The field was deserted. The parking spaces were empty, slick with water. Ethan wasn't there. The ball he had gone to retrieve was also gone. Rachel searched frantically, calling his name, running across the wet grass. The only sound was the storm. No voice answered back. In that brief 15-minute window, Ethan Miller had disappeared. The timing was painfully narrow. Investigators later calculated that the moment of disappearance had to fall between the time the last families left, around 6:50, and Rachel's return at 7:05. 15 minutes. That short span became the critical frame that police tried to piece together for years. The storm created impossible conditions. Visibility was low, rain pounded the ground, and streetlights struggled to cut through the darkness. If someone had taken Ethan, the weather provided perfect cover. Witnesses were distracted, rushing to get their children home. Few people paid attention to the edges of the field or the vehicles near the curb. Some fragments of testimony did emerge. One parent recalled seeing a van parked near the curb as the rain began to fall. It was blue, maybe green, maybe darker, he wasn't sure. He thought the engine was running, headlights on, but in the rush to leave he hadn't written down a plate number. Another parent remembered hearing an engine rev and a vehicle pulling away, but couldn't describe it further. Both accounts were too vague to build a case. It was a summer evening in Cedar Falls, Iowa, June 12, 2009. The youth soccer team had just wrapped up practice at the field behind the elementary school. Parents gathered their kids, rushing to their cars as the sky turned dark. A storm was rolling in. Rain started to fall. Within minutes, the field emptied. 7-year-old Ethan Miller stayed behind. He was helping pick up cones and went looking for a ball that had rolled toward the fence. It was the last time anyone saw him. By the time his mother Rachel returned to the field, the storm had broken wide open. Sheets of rain washed across the grass. The floodlights flickered. Ethan was gone. The police arrived quickly. They locked down the field and the nearby parking lot. Volunteers searched the woods, the river, the ditches. Flashlights cut through the rain. Dogs sniffed the mud. But the storm had wiped away every clue. The ground was slick, the air heavy. No footprints, no tire marks, nothing left to follow. Then came the first tips. Some said they saw a man in a dark raincoat near the north exit. Others swore a blue van was parked by the curb, headlights on, engine running. None of it was clear. The storm had blurred every detail. 2 suspects quickly rose to the surface. A volunteer coach with a history of accusations that never stuck. A drifter in the neighborhood who often hung around the fields. Both questioned. Both denied involvement. Neither could be tied to Ethan. The evidence just wasn't there. The weeks dragged into months. Rachel begged for answers on local TV, holding her son's photo and shaking hands. The town turned on itself. Was it the coach? Was it the drifter? Or was it someone else who had slipped away in the storm? For years the case sat cold, files gathering dust, rumors replacing facts. Until almost a decade later, when a prison inmate made a chilling confession. A name no one expected surfaced, and with it, the truth of what really happened to Ethan Miller. Ethan Miller was born in 2002. In Cedar Falls, speculation spread faster than fact. Parents whispered theories at kitchen tables. Neighbors traded suspicions. And as the night ended without answers, one thing became certain. This was no longer a child who had wandered off. This was a case of disappearance. For investigators, the timeline was brutally tight but offered no solid leads. 15 minutes, a storm, a missing boy, and a community about to face years of doubt, fear, and division. The night Ethan Miller vanished, Cedar Falls changed forever. Police wasted no time. Within an hour of Rachel's frantic call, the field was surrounded by patrol cars. Officers fanned out through the school grounds. They pushed into the tree line, scanned the parking lot, and checked the drainage ditches. Search dogs were brought in before midnight, but the storm had already stripped the scene of every clue. The rain drowned out scents, washed away prints, and blurred the ground into mud. The animals circled, confused, unable to find a trail. Volunteers began arriving in waves, neighbors, parents, high school kids. They carried flashlights and raincoats, spreading across fields and wooded patches. They searched the banks of the river, combed through tall grass, and knocked on doors nearby. By dawn, more than 200 people had joined the hunt. Still, there was no sign of Ethan. Not a shoe, not a backpack, not a scrap of clothing. The absence of evidence was alarming. Investigators faced a terrifying possibility. This wasn't a case of a boy wandering off. Someone had taken him, and the storm had wiped away every trace. News traveled fast. By morning, local radio was broadcasting live from the school. TV crews set up near the field. The image of Rachel Miller sobbing in the rain, clutching her son's photo, spread across Iowa before lunchtime. The headline was stark. A 7-year-old boy has disappeared from the soccer field. Parents in Cedar Falls were shaken. The soccer field had always been a place of safety. Now it was a crime scene. Mothers kept their children inside. Fathers walked them to school and waited until they were through the doors. Locking windows and double-checking doors became routine overnight. The police department felt the weight of that fear. The chief stood in front of cameras the next day, his voice tight. He promised a full-scale investigation, said every lead would be pursued, and urged calm. But behind the scenes, investigators were struggling. The storm had stolen their starting point. They had no clear witness, no physical evidence, no security footage worth analyzing. They needed a suspect, someone to focus on. Within 48 hours, one name rose to the surface. Gary Collins. He was 42 years old, a part-time volunteer who helped with the youth team. Parents recognized him from the sidelines. He was divorced, lived alone, and had worked in a factory until being laid off the year before. On paper, he was just another man trying to stay involved in the community. But detectives digging into his past uncovered troubling details. Years earlier, Gary had faced accusations of inappropriate conduct with minors. The cases never made it to court. There wasn't enough evidence and charges were dropped. Still, the rumors lingered. In a town like Cedar Falls, those whispers carried weight. And now, a boy was gone, and Gary had been at the field that night. There were other concerns. Witnesses told police that Gary left the practice earlier than usual. He claimed he had to deal with a family matter, but no one could confirm it. Detectives weren't satisfied. They secured a warrant and searched his home, his garage, and his van. They collected fibers, swabs, and soil samples. Every drawer, every box, every corner of the garage was inspected. If Ethan had ever been there, they hoped to find something, anything, that tied him to Gary. But nothing surfaced. No clothing, no toys, no hair, no blood. DNA tests came back negative. The van was clean. Too clean, some investigators thought. But speculation couldn't hold up in court. The lack of evidence didn't stop the community from making up its mind. Many parents believed Gary was guilty. They whispered at grocery stores, spoke in hushed tones at church. To them, the old allegations and the coincidence of the van were enough. The pressure grew. Local reporters labeled him the disgraced coach. His face appeared on nightly news broadcasts paired with graphics about the missing boy. But others weren't so sure. Some saw Gary as a convenient scapegoat. They argued that the police, under heavy pressure to act, had latched onto him too quickly. They pointed out that no evidence had tied him to the crime, no fingerprints, no DNA, no witness placing him with Ethan in that critical window. Just suspicion and rumor. For Gary, life unraveled almost overnight. He lost what little work he had. Neighbors avoided him. He was shunned at local businesses, stared at in public, and whispered about everywhere he went. He stopped showing up to games, stopped volunteering, and withdrew from the community. Investigators kept him under surveillance for months. They followed him, tracked his movements, and re-questioned him multiple times. Each time the result was the same. Nothing. No new evidence. No breakthrough. Eventually, even the lead detectives admitted they had hit a dead end. Despite the absence of proof, the suspicion lingered. Parents told their children to stay away from him. His name became synonymous with the case, whether or not he had anything to do with it. For some, Ethan's disappearance was proof of his guilt. For others, it was proof of how fear could destroy. By the end of the first year, the case against Gary Collins had stalled. The police had no grounds to arrest him. They couldn't charge him. They couldn't hold him. He remained the #1 suspect in the eyes of many, but legally, he was just another man living under a shadow. The investigation reached its first impasse. A boy was missing. A suspect stood in the spotlight, but without evidence, the system had no path forward. The frustration in Cedar Falls grew. Residents wanted answers. Parents wanted to know their children were safe. The police wanted to close the case. But instead they faced a wall. Ethan was still gone. Gary Collins was still free. And the questions only deepened. This was the state of the case. A storm-erased crime scene, a community divided, and a suspect who couldn't be convicted. The tragedy of Ethan Miller was no closer to being solved. When the case against Gary Collins began to crumble, investigators were left with nothing but frustration and unanswered questions. The town was restless, the media relentless, and the police department desperate for a new lead. They didn't have to wait long. Within weeks, another name surfaced. That name was Derek Hall. He was 28 years old, unemployed, and lived with his mother in a small run-down house only a few blocks from the elementary school. Derek was no stranger to the neighborhood. Parents recognized him because he seemed to drift around the soccer fields often, standing just close enough to watch, but never close enough to interact. His presence had made some uneasy long before Ethan vanished. Neighbors recalled how Derek lingered near practices, sometimes walking the perimeter, sometimes sitting on the bleachers without knowing any of the kids. What raised even more suspicion was that he often carried an old flip phone, holding it up as if he were taking pictures of the children playing. Few had confronted him directly, but many remembered shaking their heads, muttering under their breath, and then moving on. After Ethan's disappearance, those memories no longer felt harmless. Then came the account of a witness on the night Ethan disappeared. As the rain began pouring down, a figure was spotted near the edge of the field. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving quickly toward the side gate. The description was vague. Storm conditions made it impossible to be certain, but the neighbor said the figure looked like Derek. A raincoat concealed most details, but the walk, the posture seemed familiar. For detectives with few other options, that was enough to put Derek under the microscope. His history did him no favors. Derek had a record: petty theft, trespassing, and repeated run-ins with the law. He had once resisted arrest after being caught stealing tools from a garage. Reports described him as volatile, unpredictable, sometimes violent. To investigators, it was easy to connect that background to the disappearance of a vulnerable child. Police brought Derek in for questioning. They pressed him about his whereabouts on the night of June 12th. But there was nothing. The phone was outdated and nearly useless, filled with blurry images of random objects and stray street corners. The computer barely worked, and its contents showed no link to the missing boy. Detectives tested clothing, checked his shoes, even swabbed his car. All came back negative. No DNA, no fibers, no fingerprints tied him to Ethan or the field that night. The lack of evidence didn't stop suspicion from growing. The town latched onto Derek the way it had latched onto Gary. For many residents, Derek simply fit the part. He was odd, he was poor, he was the man no one trusted. His history of petty crime seemed like proof enough. Parents whispered at playgrounds. Children were told to stay away from him. Some neighbors crossed the street when they saw him walking. Local reporters followed the story. Headlines shifted from "Coach under fire" to "Unemployed local questioned in disappearance." Derek's face appeared on screens across Iowa, framed with words like "suspect" and "person of interest." He never admitted to wrongdoing, but in the eyes of many, he was already guilty. Police tried to push harder. They questioned him multiple times, hoping to catch him in a lie or elicit a confession. They used inconsistencies in his statements as leverage, but no matter how many hours they spent, Derek never broke. He continued to insist he had nothing to do with Ethan's disappearance. Without hard evidence, investigators could only circle the same points over and over again. By the end of the year, frustration grew. The lead detective admitted privately that the case against Derek was as thin as it had been with Gary. There was suspicion, there were rumors, but suspicion alone could not secure an indictment. In Cedar Falls, the divide widened. Some parents were convinced. They told reporters, if it wasn't Gary, it had to be Derek. They saw no other explanation. Others criticized the police, accusing them of repeating the same mistake, fixating on a convenient target to ease public anger. "They're just looking for someone to blame," one resident said. "They don't care if it's true." Derek's life collapsed under the weight of rumor. His job propped. By the time the investigation reached its third year, Ethan's case was officially labeled a cold case. Both Gary Collins and Derek Hall had been examined, interrogated, and investigated thoroughly. Neither man could be charged. The law required proof. Without it, the case stalled. The damage, however, was lasting. Gary and Derek lived under suspicion that never lifted. For Gary, the shadow of his past followed him endlessly. For Derek, his strangeness and criminal record kept him marked as the man who probably did it. For Rachel Miller, none of it mattered. Her son was still gone, and the community's finger-pointing did nothing to bring him back. In the end, Cedar Falls was left with 2 prime suspects and no justice. 2 men carried the burden of accusation. A mother carried the burden of loss. And a community carried the burden of fear. The tragedy deepened not only because a child was missing, but because every lead collapsed into dust. The case was stuck in a loop. Interviews, searches, releases. The story played out the same way again and again. Suspicion, pressure, failure. By the time years had passed, Ethan Miller's disappearance was no longer front-page news. It was just another unresolved mystery sitting in boxes at the police department. A town once united in hope had fractured into silence. For the people of Cedar Falls, the question was no longer just who took Ethan. It was whether they would ever know the truth at all. If you've been following this case, you can see how years of suspicion, false leads, and broken trust left Ethan's disappearance without answers. But the tragedy didn't end with the suspects. It carried on in the life of his mother, Rachel Miller, who was forced to live each day without knowing what happened to her son. In the next part, we'll look at how the endless search, the whispers, and the silence of a cold case broke her life apart. Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss it. And let me know in the comments. What do you think about how the investigation handled these suspects? Was the community too quick to judge? Or were the police right to follow every lead, no matter how thin? For nearly 8 years, the disappearance of Ethan Miller remained an open wound in Cedar Falls. His photo, once pinned on every telephone pole and gas station board, had faded under the sun. Leads had dried up. Investigators rotated in and out of the cold case unit, flipping through the same pages of notes, the same files of photographs, the same witness statements that led nowhere. The soccer field was still there, now filled with new children, new parents. But the shadow of what had happened in June 2009 lingered. To most, the truth seemed gone forever. Then, in early 2017, a strange story surfaced from inside the walls of an Iowa prison. Inmates talk. They brag, they lie, they exaggerate. But sometimes, buried in their words, there is truth. One prisoner was overheard telling others that he had once known the man who snatched a boy from a soccer field back in 2009. At first, no one paid much attention. Boastful claims in prison are common. Yet the details he offered, an Iowa soccer field, a boy around 7 years old, taken in the rain, were too close to Ethan Miller's case to ignore. Word of that story eventually reached investigators. They arranged interviews, checked records, and traced connections. That's when a name emerged. Mark Jensen. Jensen was 36 years old at the time of Ethan's disappearance. He worked as a delivery driver, bouncing between companies, never keeping a job long. He wasn't part of the Cedar Falls community in any meaningful way. He rented a small house just outside of town, stayed there for a few months, and then left for work in another city. At the time, his transience helped him slip past suspicion. He wasn't on any early witness lists. He wasn't connected to the team, the families, or the school. He was, in the eyes of investigators in 2009, invisible. But in 2017, the picture began to shift. When detectives pulled Jensen's history, troubling patterns appeared. He had a record: assault charges, disorderly conduct, theft. Nothing that kept him in prison long term, but enough to paint a picture of volatility and violence. Neighbors described him as reclusive. With the support of the county attorney, police obtained permission to search Jensen's property. What they found shocked even seasoned investigators. Inside his garage, tucked away in boxes and old crates, were items that immediately raised alarm. A pair of small sneakers caked with dried mud, clearly sized for a child. An old soccer jersey, torn and faded, with the number 7 on the back. And then, the most chilling discovery: traces of blood and strands of hair caught on the fabric. Samples were rushed to the state crime lab. Within days, the results came back. The DNA matched Ethan Miller. For the first time in nearly a decade, investigators had physical evidence tying a suspect directly to the missing boy. Jensen was arrested and brought into custody. During the first hours of questioning, he denied everything. He said the shoes and shirt weren't his. He claimed they must have belonged to some other tenant, that they had been left behind when he moved in. Detectives pressed him harder. They laid out the DNA results. They showed him the photos. They reminded him of his record, of the stories already circling through the prison system. As the hours wore on, Jensen began to unravel. His hands shook, his answers faltered. And finally, he broke. He admitted that on June 12, 2009, he had driven past the soccer field in Cedar Falls. The rain was coming down, but he noticed children packing up, parents leaving. Through the storm, he spotted a boy, small, blonde, lingering by the fence. Ethan Miller was reaching for a ball that had rolled out of bounds. Jensen claimed he pulled over near the side gate. He got out of his van and approached the boy, telling him he could help grab the ball and carry something back. When Ethan came closer, Jensen coaxed him toward the vehicle. Then, in a swift moment, he forced the boy inside. From there, the story turned darker. Jensen admitted that he drove off with Ethan before anyone could notice. He described actions that investigators chose not to release in detail, but his words left no doubt. Ethan never made it home because Mark Jensen ensured he wouldn't. When the news broke, Cedar Falls reacted with a mix of fury and grief. Crowds gathered at the soccer field again, not for practice or games, but for vigils. Parents cried openly, embracing their children. Volunteers who had once combed the woods wept at the realization that their efforts had never stood a chance. The truth had been locked away in Jensen's garage while the town tore itself apart with suspicion. For Gary and Derek, the development brought vindication but no relief. Gary had spent nearly a decade branded as the disgraced coach, whispered about in stores, avoided in public, treated like a criminal. Derek had lived as the neighborhood pariah, accused of being a predator, his mother shunned for raising him. Both men had lost years of their lives, reputations shredded by doubt, because investigators and the community had focused on the wrong people. Rachel Miller, Ethan's mother, sat silently when officers delivered the news. After years of searching, after nights spent crying into the void of the soccer field, after clinging to fading hope. The answer had finally arrived, but it wasn't the answer she wanted. There would be no reunion, no miracle survival story. Only confirmation that her son had been stolen and murdered. The revelation sent shockwaves beyond Cedar Falls. State and national media picked up the story, framing it as both a long-awaited breakthrough and a tragic reminder of justice delayed. Editorials questioned how Jensen had never been considered a suspect in the early investigation. Critics blasted the police for focusing so heavily on Gary and Derek while overlooking outsiders like Jensen. Others argued that the storm itself, the rain that washed away evidence and blurred every witness account, had doomed the investigation from the start. But for the people who had lived with this case day after day, those arguments were secondary. What mattered most was that the truth was finally known. The boy who vanished in the rain had not simply disappeared. He had been taken, and the man who did it had finally confessed. As the community processed the news, one emotion rose above all others: anger. Anger that it had taken so long. Anger that two innocent men had been treated as guilty. Anger that Ethan's life had been cut short and hidden away, while his killer lived freely for years. In 2017, Cedar Falls got its breakthrough, but it was not a triumph. It was a grim reminder of what had been lost, and how slowly the wheels of justice can turn. In early 2018, after almost 9 years of silence, the name Mark Jensen was finally read out in a courtroom in Black Hawk County, Iowa. He was no longer a passing figure in a cold file. He was the man accused of abducting and killing 7-year-old Ethan Miller. The trial opened with heavy attention. Reporters filled the benches, parents of Cedar Falls packed the gallery, and Rachel Miller sat in the front row, her face pale but unflinching. For years the case had gone nowhere. Now at last there was a man to stand before a judge. The prosecution wasted no time. They laid out every piece of evidence with steady precision. They showed the jury the small pair of sneakers pulled from Jensen's garage, still stained with dried mud. Their size matched Ethan's shoes. They held up the tattered number 7 jersey, the same style worn by Ethan's team. By the time closing arguments came, the outcome felt inevitable. The prosecutor reminded the jury that justice delayed did not have to mean justice denied. He asked them to remember Ethan Miller not as a file number, but as a child whose trust was betrayed. The deliberations took less than 4 hours. When the jury returned, the courtroom went silent. The foreman stood, his voice steady, and read the verdict: guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping. Mark Jensen stood no emotion. He stared forward as the judge delivered the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the first time, Ethan's case had an official ending. The man who had stolen him was locked away forever. But the trial was not just about Jensen. It was also about 2 men who had lived nearly a decade under the shadow of suspicion. Gary Collins, the volunteer coach, had endured years of whispers. Parents crossed the street to avoid him. Former friends cut ties. He had once been trusted to guide children on the soccer field, but after Ethan vanished, he was branded the disgraced coach. At the trial, police admitted publicly that Gary had no involvement, that evidence had always been lacking. For Gary, the words came too late. His marriage had collapsed, his reputation destroyed. He left the courthouse without celebration, only exhaustion. Derek Hall's life had been just as scarred. He was a troubled man even before Ethan's disappearance, but afterward he became a pariah. Children were told to stay away from him. Neighbors accused him in whispers. He was treated as a lurking predator, though there had never been proof. The trial cleared his name, but not the years of humiliation. He left with bitterness, saying, "They ruined me for nothing." The truth about Jensen gave both men technical freedom. Yet in practice, the weight of suspicion had already written itself into their lives. And then there was Rachel. She had waited almost 9 years for this moment, 9 years of haunting silence and unanswered questions. She sat through every word of the trial, her hands shaking as evidence was displayed, her eyes fixed on the man who had taken her. The impact spread beyond the courtroom. Cedar Falls itself had changed. The town that once prided itself on safety was forced to face the reality that evil could strike anywhere, even in a small field on a summer evening. Parents who had once let their children roam freely now kept them close. Coaches, teachers, and volunteers faced stricter scrutiny. The old belief that nothing bad happens here was gone forever. But with the pain also came change. In the years after the trial, Iowa introduced stricter background checks for anyone working with youth sports. Volunteer coaches had to go through fingerprinting and child protection screenings. Local schools invested in better security systems, replacing old cameras that once failed during storms. The law was clear. No case like Ethan's should ever be left to chance again. Nationally, the story of Ethan Miller became a reference point in discussions about cold cases. His file, once marked as unsolvable, was used as an example of why evidence preservation and prisoner interviews remained vital even years later. Some states passed reforms encouraging prosecutors to revisit old files with new forensic tools. For Rachel, life never returned to normal. She withdrew from nursing and lived quietly, often avoiding the public eye. Yet, she allowed Ethan's name to be used in local campaigns for child safety. A small foundation was created in his memory, funding youth sports programs and safety awareness classes. Each year on June 12th, residents gathered at the same soccer field. They lit candles, not only to mourn, but to remind each other that vigilance must never fade. Gary Collins eventually left Cedar Falls. He moved to another state, hoping to escape the shadow of his wrongful suspicion. Derek Hall struggled to rebuild, but the trial's outcome at least freed him from the constant police attention that once hounded his every step. For them, justice had come too late to save their reputations, but it gave them space to breathe again. Mark Jensen now spends his days in a maximum security prison, far from the quiet streets of Cedar Falls. His name rarely surfaces, except in legal paperwork and appeals that go nowhere. For him, and for Cedar Falls, the case left a scar, but also a lesson. The town no longer treats safety as an assumption. Parents, coaches, and police work together more closely. Cold cases in Iowa receive renewed attention, and the Ethan Miller case stands as proof that even after years, truth can surface. The story ends with Jensen behind bars, Gary and Derek vindicated, Rachel still broken, and a community forever changed. Ethan Miller is gone, but not forgotten. His life ended too soon, yet his case reshaped the way a town, a state, and even a nation looked at child safety and justice. Ethan's name is spoken every summer when children run across the soccer field where he once played. The echoes of laughter now carry both joy and caution. Parents watch more closely. Coaches take more care. And in those small changes, some good emerged from tragedy. The boy who vanished from the soccer field never came home. But his memory changed laws, changed lives, and left a mark no storm could ever wash away. If stories like Ethan's matter to you, if you believe these cases should never be forgotten, make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell so you won't miss the next investigation. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Share this video to keep the memory alive, and help us bring more attention to the stories that still wait for justice.